Good morning to you once again. Welcome to our very first RQL Research Quality and Learning guest lecture series under the theme Research Review and Practices. This will be CEPA's learning platform to learn from external experts. Today we welcome Emeritus Professor of the University of Peradeniya, Professor Kalinga Tudor Silva, who will talk to us on approaches to the study of and writing about Aragalaya. Professor Silva is a sociologist and has had a remarkable teaching career at the Department of Sociology at the University of Peradeniya for 4 decades. During this time, he taught courses in Sri Lankan society, rural sociology, sociology of South Asia, ethnicity and nationalism in Sri Lanka, sociology of poverty, social poverty and development, qualitative development, religion and development, qualitative research, gender, sexuality, and community development. Professor Silva also lectured in several colleges in the US, at the Hobart and William Smith College, the Bowdoin College and the Whittier College in California. Further, he has taught at the Assam University in Silchar, India, and the De La Salle University in the Philippines. Professor Silva, being very much a qualitative researcher, has also taught at the Postgraduate Institute of Agriculture of the University of Peradeniya, University of Sabaragamuwa, and for the National Science Foundation and the National Center for Advanced Studies. He currently teaches for postgraduate students at the University of Peradeniya in social theory. So Professor Silva has many publication and read articles to his credit, and has been an editor and co-editor for many international publications. Although Professor has contributed to many areas from malaria control to displacement and post-war issues, I feel his seminal work and contribution to sociology is on the caste structures of Sri Lanka. This was actually textbook reading for us in our undergraduate days. His latest contribution to this field was in 2020 through his paper on nationalism, caste, blindness, and the continuing problems of war displaced Panchamas in the post-war Jaffna society, published in Caste, a global journal published by Brandeis University. So recently, Professor Silva's work also was focused on the effects of COVID-19 post-pandemic period, and also on the recent development of the political history of this country. Professor Silva is a Fulbright scholar. He received his BA from the University of Peradeniya and his PhD from the University of Monash. Finally, it is actually very much a pleasure to know that Professor Silva was perhaps the first executive director of CEPA from 2002 to 2003. And ever since his time is also a CEPA member, one of our longest standing members. Welcome to you, Professor, once again to talk to us about the process of writing under the title Approaches to the Study of and Writing about Aragalaya. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Indika. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Okay. Excellent.
Okay, thank you very much. First, let me thank CEPA and Dr. Indika Bulankulama for inviting me for this forum. I'm very happy to be involved in this. And as Indika already described, I'm going to talk about Aragalaya. Actually, when Indika invited me, she wanted me to talk about my current research. So I thought this would be the best topic, given the fact that we are all, living through this crisis. So you can relate to it, and I can relate to it. Actually, what I'm going to do in this presentation is to introduce two different approaches towards understanding Aragalaya. One is what I call political economy perspective. The other one is the symbolic interaction perspective. These are two vastly different perspectives, but I thought, by talking about them and by trying to see how applicable they are for this understanding the current Sri Lankan crisis, you will also understand, the difficulties and complications involved in applying social theory. And this presentation does not have a firm empirical foundation. I must admit right at the beginning, this is more of a analytical perspective about how to make sense of Aragalaya. And I believe that you will probably have more first-hand information about Aragalaya than I do. So I expect you to share your thoughts and experiences as well as we go on. Uh, so this is the outline of my presentation. I will first talk about the political economy perspective and its strengths and weaknesses when we try to apply it to kind of uprising and a crisis like what we're experiencing right now. And then I will move on to the second perspective, which is symbolic interactionist perspective, and we'll do the same, uh, basically exploring its strengths and limitations when we try to apply it to the Aragalaya. The basic point I want to highlight in my presentation is the need for an eclectic theoretical approach for understanding the social crisis we are facing right now. First of all, I have to say that when it comes to theory, I'm not a purist. I'm not believing in one theory as the meta-narrative, as a explanatory framework that explains the whole reality. And my view is that we need to learn from different perspectives in order to understand a complex phenomenon like the Aragalaya. To give a few words of introduction about the political economy perspective, um, it presents a systemic view of something like the crisis. Systemic view meaning looking at the political dimensions, economic dimensions, social dimensions, and the interaction among them. So that is why perhaps this perspective may be relevant to what we are looking at, because it's not just one crisis. We have a serious economic crisis before us, and at the same time, it has in some ways produced equally complex political crisis. So from that viewpoint, perhaps political economy perspective is relevant for us. Now, of course, there are different strands of political economy. Um, uh, Perhaps the best known is the perspective provided by Karl Marx, his historical materialism, where he looked at the entire reality, but basically looking at economics and the material dimension as the central core of reality, and everything else fall in line when you recognize the economic foundation of society. And on the other hand, Weber also identified himself as a political economist. In fact, he first held the chair of political economy in Heidelberg University. So he identified himself as a political economist as well. But unlike Marx, he did not look at the economy as the central core of everything else. And he pointed out that ideas, even religious ideas, are as important as the economics in trying to understand the social reality. I'm actually more inclined towards Weber in this presentation, although I also draw from Marx quite a bit. And then, of course, people like Adam Smith, the founder of economics, also used the word political economy as an overarching framework for understanding the economics. The basic point I want to highlight in this presentation is the intermingling of the economic and the political in Aragalaya. In many ways, it is an economic crisis as well as a political crisis, which have actually fed into each other and reinforcing each other. So in trying to find a solution, we have to look at this, intermingling of economic and political in the crisis. Let me quickly comment on the economic crisis. I'm not an economist, but I have drawn from the work of several economists with whom I'm working right now on a research project on this crisis. So, on the one hand, we are facing a debt crisis. We have borrowed so much, especially from foreign donors, and now actually we have to borrow more money to repay the debts we have taken, and we are in a default situation where we have declared we don't have foreign currency to pay back the debts. So that is the debt crisis, and this is connected with the kind of depletion of foreign reserves, so that we don't have dollar assets to import to basically continue importing of essential commodities like fuel, gas, and so on and so forth. So that is the economic part of the crisis. And actually, this slide indicates perhaps the possible role of the pandemic in depletion of Sri Lanka's foreign reserves. Obviously, we have spent additional money because of the pandemic to buy vaccines and other things needed to address the pandemic. But clearly, pandemic is not the only reason, because if we compare ourselves with our neighboring countries like Bangladesh, India, Bhutan, Pakistan, they have also gone through the same pandemic. But during this period, actually, their foreign reserves have increased. For instance, Bangladesh foreign reserves increased from end of 2019 to end of 2021 by 41%. And in the case of India, it's 39%. Whereas in the case of Sri Lanka, like our foreign assets have declined by 79%, almost 80%. So obviously we have done something quite different from what everybody else has done. So in some ways, this is what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to explain using this political economy model. This is from actually this based on Minister of Finance data in the end about our basically distribution of our outstanding foreign debts. You can see we are indebted to multilateral donors. Almost 23% of our outstanding foreign debts are to multilateral donors like ADB, World Bank, and so on. And then another 17% bilateral donors, Japan, India, China, and other. Now, this shows that by the end of December 2020, Japan was the primary bilateral donor to whom we were indebted. But I have looked more recently, I have looked at 2021 data, and the situation has changed. China has now become the leading foreign country to which we are indebted, and I will comment on that later. But our biggest problem has been heavy reliance on financial markets, international financial markets, like borrowing using ISBs, international sovereign bonds. Almost 60% of our outstanding international debts are to this, because of transactions we have made in the financial markets. So this is something that we must keep in mind when we look at the nature of the economic crisis. When we look at the political economy of the crisis, we have to, now I have briefly described, perhaps in a fairly layman language, the economic crisis. Now, when we look at the political economy side of it, you have to look at the political antecedents of these economic problems that I laid out, and the political repercussions. So this is where political economy perspectives come into play. It is not just an economic crisis. Obviously, it has, this economic crisis has certain political antecedents, and also it has led to political repercussions. Briefly touch on political antecedents. One of the important political configurations we have to address is over-concentration of power in the hands of an executive president following the 1978 constitutional change, under which we basically established this central authority called executive president. And of course, from 2005 onwards, it has also led to concentration of power within one political family, as we know, Rajapaksa family. And some time ago, there were 5 cabinet members from this family. So that partly explains the current political crisis. And there has been high-profile politically motivated development projects. So I will actually show some visuals of some of these projects a little later. So because of the concentration of power within one family, they have been able to basically make decisions on their own without consulting professionals, without getting inputs from other parties. They have been able to basically guide, not really guide, but control, dominate the economy in multiple ways, and borrow money, most importantly, particularly from China. And this has also led to reported high levels of corruption, and not only by politicians, not only by members of the family that I referred to, but also their supporters, and reported use of development funds for political campaigns is another important aspect of the political economy we are dealing with, and faulty and irresponsible decision making at all levels. And I already mentioned that total disregard for professional opinions in financial decision making. And final point I want to mention, but I don't have time to elaborate. Maybe during discussion we can take it up. Use of Sinhala Buddhist hegemony to legitimize the ruling regime and its problematic decision making. I will elaborate it perhaps later. These are some examples of poor investments that we all know. Nilum Koluna costing over 100 million US dollars, and up to now not producing any returns. And this is obviously built with financial support from China. The second one is the Port City project, which we are working on right now. We are not sure the economics of this at this moment, but there is high probability that it will be just like other investments made by the same regime. And then poor investment number 3 is Hambantota Harbour, Magampura Mahinda Rajapaksa Port, as we all know it. We have already basically leased this harbour to China, which initially lent money for this. And even this is a statement from Chinese authority that they even now they find that this is not a economically viable project. Okay, and then of course there are other investments which I don't have time to go into, like Hambantota Conference Center, cricket ground, and also the international airport in Hambantota. That also named after Mahinda Rajapaksa. These populist politics have actually produced fancy development projects. These are some of the general characteristics of these development projects. They are politically inspired, high cost, high profile, mega projects. And China has been the leading donor for these projects. And they have obviously added to the debt burden of the country. They are highly visible, but very limited impact on economic growth. And basically, they are loss-making investments as far as the current situation goes, and also produce environmental concerns, particularly in the case of Port City project and even Hambantota Harbour. And for that matter, even Mattala International Airport, because it's located in a wildlife reserve area. So these are some negative features of these development projects. And I referred to problematic policy decisions. I think you all know this, so I will just mention them. I don't elaborate. Overnight shift to organic agriculture in April 2021. Tax cuts affecting state revenue after the Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa got elected in 2019. Delay in seeking IMF bailout. So that has actually largely contributed to the dollar crisis we are facing. And then artificial control of the exchange rate, which has also complicated the economic crisis. Now I'm actually looking at some of the impacts of the economic crisis, these long queues for fuel, gas, and then there's another queue in this slide. I don't know whether you recognize what that queue is. That queue is for obtaining passports because many people are eager to get out of the country because of the crisis. So it shows that this economic crisis has impacted on people's life in diverse ways. And it's not just one category. Here you see motorbikes, three wheels, cars, and also the gas crisis has affected everybody. And then the power crisis, the electricity crisis has also affected different segments of the population. So we are talking about economic crisis, which has had impacts across the board. I think that's important for us to know. Now I am moving towards political consequences of the economic crisis. Earlier I mentioned about political antecedents. Uh, Initially, there was kind of unorganized protests, particularly from petrol and diesel queues. When after waiting for sometimes many hours and multiple days, they sometimes found that petrol or diesel is not available. Then there was immediate kind of spontaneous, uh, like protests. Often they used their vehicles to block roads as a way of protesting. And sometimes they use empty gas cylinders to block roads. So it shows that they were kind of spontaneous. They were not organized by any particular parties, but it came out spontaneously. Then there was kind of more systematic protests like candlelight vigils in certain neighborhoods in Colombo. Then street protests leading to Mirihana event. And then it kind of got concentrated in several places in Colombo and elsewhere in the country by this encampment process, formation of encampments in Golface Green and in front of temple trees, and also elsewhere in the country in other cities. Um, this So protests got kind of aggravated over time, and of course there was a violent attack on Aragalaya, I think on May 9th, and then there was counterattacks, and this basically triggered resignation of the then prime minister and finally the president. And of course, now we are witnessing a kind of state repression. And basically, even though Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe was supportive of Aragalaya initially, uh, in the parliament he mentioned that Aragalaya should be supported, and he sympathized with their grievances. After he became the president, he himself has started state repression in diverse forms. Many Aragalaya actors have been arrested and still being arrested. And not only being arrested, but they are sometimes arrested under Prevention of Terrorism Act, which allows the uh, police to keep them for long periods without presenting them to the courts. So these are some of the political consequences. So to come back to the political economy perspective and its strengths, it clearly helps us understand the intermingling of political and economic factors. And as I have already illustrated. And also the role of organizations like Bar Association, Antare, JVP, and Peradeniya kind of political parties, and also networks like students from international schools and universities. Um, like the it's very difficult to uh, basically argue that Aragalaya is driven by only one segment of the population. It has people from middle classes, even upper middle classes, people from kind of working class backgrounds, people from very deprived urban poor, like Watu type backgrounds. So we are dealing with protests by diverse groups in Aragalaya. And then, of course, more recently, the authorities have turned to repression as the way to deal with Aragalaya, contradicting their own positions in the past. So we can actually draw from political economy perspective in trying to understand these responses. And also now, of course, we have already signed the staff level agreement with the IMF, and IMF remedies for this crisis are primarily economic, but we know we are dealing with something more than, or something that is not restricted to economics. So the IMF sponsored remedies alone will probably not work to address the larger problem. Um, and then we need a more comprehensive approach that includes not only that response to the economic crisis, but also response to the political crisis and the social unrest, which seems to be widespread in different segments of the population, particularly among youth. And also this points out this standard term globalization and its discontents. So we are dealing with kind of economic crisis and a political crisis which has global dimensions, and the discontents, social unrest that these macro processes pose to society. Okay, let me quickly, yes, okay. But we are analytical challenges for political economy perspective. Political economy perspective is useful to some extent, but it doesn't explain the entire thing. One issue is Aragalaya is a broad-based mass movement rather than an agitation by a particular social class. Particularly if you take a Marxist political economy perspective, they look at class as the driver of change. But in this instance, even though class elements may be operative, uh, the we are dealing with a kind of public uprising, not limited to one class or one segment of the population. Uh, Also, another issue is social derivative of economic and political, or has its own dimensions. Now, it seems to me in the Aragalaya there are also several social dimensions, which I will refer to a little later. For instance, social media has played an important role in triggering. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you, Professor.
Okay, all right. And then we have to also understand the role of art in sustaining Aragalaya, and I will actually elaborate it a little bit more later, and the role of religious actors within Aragalaya. So it's not just a kind of politically motivated protest movement. It has diverse dimensions, and actually the IT or ICT technology has also in some ways contributed to the formation of Aragalaya. So we need to go beyond the economics to understand the larger landscape of Aragalaya. Now I want to quickly move to symbolic interactionist approach, which is the second approach I want to develop in relation to Aragalaya. There are several aspects of symbolic interactionism that I want to talk about. I think, as most of you know, symbolic interactionism is an important sociological theory perspective which evolved in US, particularly contributed by people like Herbert's Mill, and several American sociologists, including Erving Goffman, and someone called, I think his name is Taylor, has also contributed. He has actually tried to use symbolic interactionist approach to understand African American protests in US way back in the 1950s and 60s. So I found his contribution is quite useful. So one idea that is relevant to us is the definition of the situation. How do different actors define the crisis, people who are involved in the agitations, as well as authorities, police, security forces? How do they define the situation? I think we can draw from symbolic interactionist approach to understand these different definitions of the situation. Self and identity issues are also quite important. Self and identity issues meaning like, like different, one issue is who identifies with Aragalaya. Who are the Aragala Karuo or Aragala actors, and how they identify themselves. This is quite important here. There is also kind of meanings, like contested meanings, how people, like how do they define their activity, and how do they identify the authorities, and what are the problems with authorities? Obviously, there are contested meanings. There is also violence and counter-violence, even though Aragalaya actors actually basically it was a non-violent kind of agitation. I think there was a deliberate effort to use non-violent protest. On May 9th, there was attack on them by pro-government, violent groups. So that triggered kind of counter-violence. So even though many Aragalaya actors did not believe in violence as a way, as a method of social change, eventually, perhaps at least some Aragalaya actors became violent themselves. Now, let me elaborate quickly representation and definition of the situation. Some of these, slogans, I think, in some ways describe the definition of the situation by the protesters. Give our stolen money was obviously one key message from the Aragalaya. You have messed with the wrong generation. Basically, here the idea is that the young generation will not tolerate this kind of domination and also misuse of public money and things like that. These are some pictures from Gotagogama's starting with Goldface. Now Occupy Goldface happened, I think, in late April. And in some ways this is similar to other Occupy movements, in different countries. Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street would be one example. So obviously there has been kind of influence of this idea in different protest movements all over the world, including Arab Spring. So the same pattern can be seen here. And obviously the original campaign of the protesters was to get rid of the president. And then, Gotagogama became the key message. Now, this tent, is an important aspect of the encampment idea. This is not a this is common to most of the Occupy movements. And you can see buildings, storied buildings in the background, and basically the protesters look at them. They make a distinction between these symbols of modernization and look at them as serving basically one sector of the population, whereas tents are quite different. They are like they indicate they are in some ways they don't have a kind of, they are not part of that that structure. Obviously, Goldface was very symbolic place in the center of Colombo. With many hotels in the background and big commercial areas in the neighborhood, and also the parliament. So they selected this central location to carry out their campaign. So this is different from street protests. This is a permanent place from where actually they can they continue to display their slogans and continue to carry out their protests. And of course, it spread to other towns like Mathura and Kandy, Gotagogamas. When we talk about symbolism, this is also interesting. Sataka wearing garbage bags, very symbolic of their protest. This is to basically indicate this importance of interpretation and meaning making as part of the Aragalaya. This is actually a post I photographed in Mathura, Gotagogama. It's a kind of counter-hegemonic slogan. Rajafaksala kiyanne pirit nulen malubana un ban. So it's a kind of counter-hegemonic statement about the ruling family at the time. There are also self and identity issues. Actually, women played an important role in Aragalaya as much as men. Here I'm showing 3 musketeers. I refer to as 3 musketeers who were involved in Aragalaya from different generations. So women played an important role. Often they came forward not only to places like Goldface and in front of temple trees, but street protests and agitations of different kinds. Here there's a couple with a newborn child uh, brought into Gotagugama. It shows how important the Aragale was for them, even to bring their newborn child to the Aragale. So obviously there is identification with the Aragale by the public, and then of course these are also important identity issues. Obviously, they look at Aragale as a common struggle among different groups, whether talking about Sinhalese, Tamil, Muslim. Uh, we are all part of the Aragale. And some sisters actually who played an important role in Aragale. Here, sisters are protesting against problems faced by farmers, fishermen, plantation people, and also their anti-hegemonic kind of campaign against, what they call Jativadi or ethnic nationalism. This is a very interesting picture of Aragale protesters who have observed SIL within the Aragale premises. So obviously uh, there are many people who are strong religious actors, who were part of the Aragale as well. These are some more pictures where religious personalities involved. And also the Aragale brought into the scene many different categories of people, substance users, LGBTQ people, and also urban Varta communities and political, I think there was a debate about whether they are kind of political campaign or non-political campaign. Most people prefer to use the word, most of the people involved in Aragale use the word nirpakshika, I think. Nirpakshika meaning non-party. Some use the word nirdeshapalana also. So obviously they didn't look at themselves as a political campaign which tries to gain rights within the existing political system. Rather, it's a kind of protest against the existing system, and they were obviously talking about system change. Uh, in other words, they didn't want to identify themselves with one or more political parties. People came from different political backgrounds, but I think initially they had a discussion and they decided not to identify with any one particular political party during the struggle. This is also, like cartoon-like art presentation, and here you can see a queue of people waiting for food. Food was cooked and served in Aragale, and a lot of people from different backgrounds, street people also came and joined the Aragale as part of this. Violence and counter-violence on May 9th. I will not go into detail about this because of time constraint. But obviously there was a pro-government attack on Aragale on May 9th. And then there was a backlash from people, against people who came to attack Aragale, that you can see. And there was even a murder of MP and setting fire to some of the houses of politicians, setting fire to their vehicles, and so on and so forth. So even though Aragale started as a non-violent movement, there were times when, violence obviously came into the picture. Obviously, violence was first triggered by pro-government like actors, and maybe in response, some sections of Aragale fighters also turned to violence. Actually, one of the important things that we need to look at is the creative use of art and performance in Aragale. Here we can see some people actually doing artwork, perhaps to create, display boards within Gotagogama, and the use of Raban Pada and Virindu, this kind of traditional artistic expressions uh, to motivate people and to basically encourage people to protest against the status quo. I don't have time to go into. I think if necessary, I can listen to part of it, but I think I will skip that. Uh, uh, okay. Uh, Now, the strength of symbolic interactionism as a framework for understanding Aragalaya is one is it helps us conceptualize public response to the economic crisis, how public became drawn into this protest, firstly by waiting in queues and so on, and experiencing, some people didn't have even water or food while they are waiting in queues. And some people collapsed in the queues and several deaths. So in some ways, we need to take a interactionist kind of perspective to understand this, different categories of people getting drawn into Aragalaya. Uh, Perhaps we also need to look at the role of social media in triggering an Aragalaya, in the sense, basically creating widespread kind of public uh, grievance that in turn supported the Aragalaya. Uh, there are diverse interpretation of Aragalaya. Again, we can use symbolic interactionist kind of approach. Obviously, for the Aragalaya actors, it was an act of liberation and democratization. They obviously felt that they are contributing to democratization, and they obviously wanted to get rid of the existing regime, which in their view was corrupt, and had contributed to the crisis. On the other hand, for the authorities, increasingly they tried to obviously they tried to uh, present Aragalaya as a kind of antisocial behavior. I earlier told you about Turner's idea about protest in US. Now, Turner's idea was that initially African American protests were understood not as protest but as crime, as kind of things like robbery, shop breaking, breaking into shops and things like that. But subsequently, it was understood as a kind of social protest. Okay, so. But here too, I think authorities and even media, I think pro-government media tried to present Aragalaya in a negative kind of perspective as the Aragalaya was launched. Afterwards, situation changed, but once again now with the uh, repression, perhaps more and more, like for instance, after they cleared the Golface, there were pictures of cannabis plants, showing perhaps in media, indicating that many Aragala actors were involved in perhaps using ganja and maybe other drugs. So there is obviously different interpretations about Aragala and why they are doing it, and so on and so forth. So there we need symbolic interactionist type of approach. But obviously there are limits of this approach when it comes to understanding the economic crisis. Obviously there is a genuine economic crisis we are dealing with. And also symbolic interactionism tends to neglect the power dynamics in society. And if at all they examine what some people may look at as superficial dimensions, like symbolism uh, and manipulation of symbols and so on and so forth. And also symbolic interactionism does not have any kind of practical remedies. Rather, it's a academic, analytical approach, trying to understand this kind of movement. I think I have more or less come to the end of my presentation, because I also want to give you some time to ask questions and maybe have a discussion. These are 4 take-home messages that I thought we can draw from this presentation. One is that no theory is perfect. Okay, theory as a master narrative is not really helpful in this instance, because actually, in my view, each theory only presents a partial explanation of reality. So that, as I said earlier, in terms of theory, we should not try to be purists, but rather try to mix and match and use different theories to explain different aspects of a reality. So that is perhaps one important point that comes from this presentation. And also related to that is that the same reality can be analyzed from diverse perspectives. Political economy and symbolic interactionism are vastly different theoretical approaches which look at different dimensions of an issue or a phenomenon. And so perhaps, especially as researchers, we can it's useful to know that perhaps no theory provides a perfect solution to our problem, and we need to borrow from different theoretical perspectives, and also the need to be open to different analytical perspectives. Instead of trying to lock ourselves up in grand theories or master narratives of one kind or another. It is perhaps whatever theory you use we must use it critically, and try to be sensitive to the strengths as well as limitations of each theory. I couldn't talk too much about the methodology in this presentation, but what I feel is perhaps in trying to understand a phenomenon such as Aragalaya, we also need to have a methodological pluralism. In other words, not only use quantitative data like what I described earlier, like the depths to different countries and different lenders. Obviously, we need the quantitative approach, but we can also use a lot of qualitative data. In this instance, actually, in the project we are currently launching, to study Aragalaya, we are basically looking at qualitative approach, which will include, doing case studies of key leaders of Aragalaya, and maybe conducting person-to-person interviews, key informant interviews with different actors in Aragalaya, and also do what is called e-research. E-research meaning using data available in social media, and generally web-based sources to understand social problem. Actually, this, of course, there is a long history of e-research, both in natural sciences and social sciences. But in social sciences, they became prominent due to the pandemic. Researchers could not go and do ethnographic work because the researchers could spread the disease to their respondents, or even researchers could get infected. So they had to think of different alternatives, and even person-to-person interviews were difficult because of the requirement for social distancing and things like that. So COVID-19 pandemic basically led to rethinking of social research methodology, and we feel that that we should also kind of benefit from this situation, try to find alternatives to conventional, research strategies. So maybe you have some ideas, and obviously now pandemic has become kind of less vigorous, but nevertheless we are still living in a situation where several cases are still reported, and there are periodic upsurges in the pandemic. So perhaps what we mean by e-research probably has a much greater relevance in the current context in Sri Lanka. And also, obviously, there is no money for research right now because of the economic crisis. Quite apart from daily necessities, there's hardly any money from within the government or from other sources. So we need to perhaps, and this might be relevant for CEPA as well, identify kind of low-cost strategies for data collection, data analysis, and so on and so forth. I think that's the end of my presentation. So I have taken almost 1 hour and 10 minutes. So we have quite a lot of time for discussion. So I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much once again, Professor Tudor Silva, for taking up our invitation and spending your time today with us. It was very useful and insightful, especially from a theoretical and methodological approach to look at the various approaches to the Aragalaya. So thanks once again. And I hope we can continue this conversation. I think several of us wish to be part of a continuing conversation. So thanks once again. And I would also like to bring your attention to the next guest lecture, which is fixed for the 6th of October at 3:30 p.m. And it is by Professor Sasanka Pereira from the South Asian University in New Delhi on the topic Social Research Beyond Statistics and Qualification, Thoughts on Archives and Historical Sources. So thanks once again. Thank you very much, everyone. Professor Silva, thank you once again.